What is the link between Imam al-Mahdi and Gog and Magog? And when will the Imam al-Mahdi say takbir 3 times? I am not aware of this part of the subject. The link between the Imam al-Mahdi and Gog and Magog. The answer is that Imam al-Mahdi is a descendant of Prophet Muhammad, Allah's blessing be upon him, who will be sent by Allah Most High into the world to restore the valid model of a state with Allah. That valid model of a state was called Holy Israel, and it was established by the Prophet David, Nabi Dawood alayhi salam. And then with his son Solomon, Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam, that model of a state became the ruling state in the world. That model of a state was replicated when Prophet Muhammad, Allah's blessing be upon him, established the holy state in Medina, the Islamic state. And then when that model of a state disappeared from the world and was now replaced by a secular, godless model of a state with which we now live around the world. When Akhir Zaman comes, that model of a state must be restored. Why? Because Jesus, the Messiah, is coming back. And Allah taught him the Quran. So when he comes back, he's coming back not only to his followers, but also to the followers of Nabi Muhammad, Allah's blessing be upon him. So when he arrives here, it would be a pathetic spectacle if we still live with the Republic of Egypt and the monarchy of Morocco and the Republic of Algeria and the King of Malaysia and Indonesia and all the rest. The model of a state with Allah, that model must be restored before the Messiah returns. And that is the function of Imam al-Mahdi. To restore the valid model of a state. So goodbye to Kuwait. I was giving this lecture in Manhattan in the 1990s in a big masjid. And I was not aware that the Kuwaiti ambassador was sitting right in front of me. And I said, when the Imam comes and the Khilafah state is restored, goodbye to Kuwait. The ambassador was not happy with that. Because the Khilafah state, or the holy state, would now be restored. This is the primary function of Imam al-Mahdi. Gog and Magog have a different function. The primary function of Gog and Magog is to bring the Israelite people back to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, to reclaim it as their own. And so Gog and Magog first took control of modern Western civilization, controlling power in the West. They still control power in the West. And Gog and Magog then spread out all over the world and took control of power in the world. And then Gog and Magog brought the Jews back to Jerusalem to reclaim it as their own. And they have now accomplished that mission. And Gog and Magog will be destroyed by Allah when Nabi Isa, Jesus, returns. So between the Imam and Gog and Magog, the only link that there is that the Imam will be able to restore. He'll be able to liberate the Arabian Peninsula, and Gog and Magog will not be able to prevent it. And the Imam will say, get rid of Saudi Arabia and restore a Khilafah state with the capital in Mecca, and Gog and Magog will not be able to stop them. Once that Khilafah state is restored, that's the beginning of the end of Israel.